It's live.
Mic's on. Is the recording on?
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. I'm calling to order this meeting of the Substandard Living Conditions Committee, Thursday, August 9th, 2018 at 7 p.m. The clerk call the roll.
Alderman Ernie Jetty.
Here.
Alderman at Large Brandon Michael Laws.
Here.
Alderman Jan Smith.
Here.
And Alderman Linda Harry Gathright is present.
And I am
Alderman-
present as well.
Okay.
We also have, was there any voting? Also present, just for the
attendance?
record, is Corporation Counsel Bolton.
Stephen Bolton. And we also have here, supposed to be in attendance, I guess, Bobby Bagley.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't see her, though, so...
Liz,
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't see her, but you do.
Director of Community Service Division.
Okay. So the first part of this meeting is public comment. If anybody would like to make public comment, feel free to step up to the microphone, give your name and address, make any comments that you need. Please be brief so that we can get onto the meeting, and then we'll have discussion. And then the meeting will be followed by a public comment period as well. Seeing as no one is there for public comment, the first agenda item we have is a presentation of city services provided by the Community Services Division. Oh, I think this is the same agenda item as last time. It's public health, I believe. So we have a presentation from the Public Health Department. Director Bagley, if you'd like to come and grab a seat. Ren, if whoever's going to present.
Either place, wherever you're comfortable.
I think that seat's the best one, just my opinion. So in previous meetings, we've discussed different situations that are faced by both tenants and landlords. And we're just trying to get an understanding of what's going on in the city from both perspectives and what services the city provides respective to those. So if you'd like to give us a summary or discussion of what the public health does for inspections, and what the state of those activities are.
Yes. Good evening. Bobby Bagley, Director of the Division of Public Health and Community Services with Ren Boydwin, who is the Deputy Health Officer and the Lab Director for our Environmental Health Department. So as far as services that the division provides with regards to, is it specific to complaints with substandard housing or?
Well, this would be a good idea to identify your role so that people use your services appropriately and effectively and are aware of what you offer.
So just in general?
Hmm?
Oh, okay. So the division provides services that are directed at protecting and promoting the health and well-being of the citizens in Nashua primarily through 4 different departments: our Environmental Health Department, Welfare Department, Community Health, and Community Services. Under the state provisions through our grants, we also provide services regionally that focus on emergency preparedness, as well as providing public health network services. And through some of the state grants under the Department of Health and Human Services, some of those services also provide disease investigation for communicable diseases such as sexually transmitted infections, tuberculosis, HIV and AIDS, hepatitis A, hepatitis B. There's about 64 to 70 different diseases that are reportable to the state that we will provide investigative services for. And the reason for that is to decrease the spread of those infectious diseases, make sure that we can get people connected to services so that they can be treated as well. Some of the other services that may be regional might include like case management, asthma case management, and then also TB case management and investigation. The staff that provides those services are usually trained registered nurses, as well as trained community health workers that are trained to do contact investigation and to notify and connect with individuals to get them connected to services. For community services, things around emergency preparedness, the staff that provide those services are funded through state grants and, are trained in emergency preparedness and response to events that could potentially be a threat or present as a harm to our residents. Those things might be connected to infectious diseases like a large hepatitis A outbreak or a large hepatitis B outbreak. Our emergency preparedness coordinator and program managers under that department will work with the community health staff as well as with environmental health staff, and will launch a combined and collaborative effort to address those types of outbreaks. The welfare department provides emergency assistance to individuals that may have circumstances where they're in an immediate need for emergency assistance for housing, to help cover the cost of prescription medications. They may even get support with bus passes so they can get back and forth to appointments or to work as well. And there's the resources that we provide through welfare will also cover prescription medications if folks need that as well. And then environmental health services, Ren is here, can talk a little bit more about the specifics of some of the services that are provided through environmental health, but overall, the division's role is to serve in a leadership capacity to address any issues that could pose a threat to our community, whether it be either through disease or through some type of biological threat.
I would think that the resources for emergency management and planning might be of interest to landlords particularly, because if they did have a situation where they displaced multiple residents, that would be the department coordinating that effort. So we recently had a sprinkler fire, if that's accurate, over at the Layton House, and I know your department was very much involved in making sure that people were housed while repairs were being made, doing the inspections while the building was brought back online. So the health department should be considered a resource for landlords as well as tenants who might have concerns about things happening in their building or that type of thing.
And any type of environmental conditions that can lead to an exacerbation, for instance, with asthma. So we do asthma case management. When the nurses go in to do the education, it's to look at what are some of the triggers in the environmental settings or in the housing setting that could cause issues for the child that may have asthma, or even for the adult. So, for instance, a cockroach infestation could be a problem for an asthmatic. Other housing conditions would, of course, be those things related to lead poisoning, where the case management, is to make sure that the child is protected. So the staff will go and do an investigation. The state will also do an investigation of the home as well to identify where that lead exposure, could be, in the home. So in that aspect, we are a resource for individuals in housing and should be connected or contacted for that. But we also work with community services, our Sarah's department with that as well, because they do, together we do the lead case management investigation with them. Community development.
Okay. And then do we want to talk more about environmental health?
Yes, please. Thank you. It's very nice seeing you all tonight. My name is Ren Bodwin. One of the things that we do, a lot of different services, so I'll give the overview first, and then I'll kind of talk about a little bit what we can do in the actual realm of like housing. So in our field, we have 3 fields folks that go out. We inspect all of the restaurants within Nashua. Any place that serves food does hold a food license. There's about 530 of those currently. And we inspect those anywhere between 2 and 4 times every year to ensure they're up to food code and that folks that are going out there eating are getting safe food. We also inspect all of the public or common use pools that are in the city, which there's about 100 of, and do testing on their water to make sure that certain pathogens are not present in that pool water.
We have 100 pools?
We do. That does include all your hotels, your workout clubs, your like condos, all those places that we would either call public or common use, of which there are 100.
I was confusing that with public, and
Yeah.
I was a little like, really? Okay.
Some of the other programs that we do is we oversee any like septic system which is put into Nashua. So although most of the city is on sewer, we still have I'd say a little over 1,000 homes that are still on like septic. They're usually on the edge of town. So we make sure that when those systems are put in, that they're put in at a sufficient depth where the groundwater in that area will not carry away any human waste to make that harmful. Other programs that we do is we inspect foster homes, we inspect childcare, we inspect schools for the state, as well as have oversight over the Rabies Control Act. We do surveillance through a third party for arboviral, which are more your ticks and your other bugs that could transmit some sort of illness to you. So those are our major programs. In terms of housing, the role of a health officer in the state is usually in smaller areas are dual role. Nashua and some of the larger areas are special in the sense that we have a separate code office as well as a separate health office. So many other areas where usually your health officer is also your code officer, we're very fortunate here. We have two, so we're not in the terms of health bogged down by as many home calls that code deals with. However, we do partner with them on a regular basis. We partner with them if they see anything that they're worried about in terms of public health or something that they think is a public health threat. They will call us and they will ask for us to join them on their site visits and vice versa. If we get called and we see issues that could deal with the housing code, then we will call code in to help us out. So we do a lot of guidance calls for like bed bugs, a lot of guidance calls for mold. I'd say other than bed bugs, mold's probably our second biggest call. And unfortunately, there's no laws at a federal level, state level, or a local level in terms of mold. So there's a lot of guidance in how to control moisture because there's a lot of laws that do talk about moisture and water damage, and mold needs water. So we kind of guide people on how to address that aspect to it. So we provide a lot of education and a lot of training in those areas, in both of those areas, to try to help people out as much as they can when they're dealing with those issues.
Do you also address issues like lead or asbestos if they were complaint driven?
Yes, so in those areas, when it comes to housing, it is a complaint-driven field because there's so much housing stock, and in terms of how much staff is actually present, we just can't go out and look at every area. So we do get a lot of calls from my neighbors who are worried that their neighbor's working on an old house that has lead paint and they're scraping it off. So we will go out as soon as we can to do a site visit. If we notice some older paint and is flaking, we will ask them to stop working. Because of the RRP, it's the renovate and remodel and paint rule from the EPA, a lot of that jurisdiction lies with them. So we partner with the Region 1 of the EPA, which is housed out of Boston. So we will relay any photos and any actions that we take in terms of lead to them, and then they will send out their folks to do that final follow-up. For asbestos, we will also react if someone thinks that someone is doing some asbestos work in a housing unit that is not occupied by the owner, because there are different laws for single-family homes which are occupied by the owner than there is for a multi-unit that has other folks in it that do not own the actual property. If there's any work in those homes that's not being done right, we by law, they have to make sure that they're using someone who is certified and who is licensed to remove that hazardous waste. So if there's any work on the outside, some of the asbestos siding, which is still present on lots of homes, and someone is taking that down and they're not bagging it right or doing that in the appropriate manner, we will go out there and we will issue a stop order on that work, and then make sure that they hire someone that can do that properly. So that's kind of our role in those two areas.
Is there any kind of registry or resource guide for places that might provide inspections or asbestos abatement or, pest control, any of that kind of stuff? Like if a landlord was looking for, okay, I know I need to do something here, but who does regular inspections? Where do I go? Is that something you can refer people to, or?
Yes, so a lot of people usually call us and say, hey, we have this project, there's some waste here, we don't know who to hire for it. So at the state offices on the state des.gov website, there's a link on there that says A to Z. You click on that list, you click on A, you go to the asbestos link, and there's a whole list there of who is licensed to take care of that kind of work, who can do all the fixing up of it, who can legally remove it from the actual property, where it can go. In Nashville, we're very fortunate where we have one of the few dumps in our state where the asbestos waste can go to. So we do have an
I
asbestos
mean, I
section
guess
of
that's
our
kind of
landfill,
fortunate, but
which is fortunate, but mainly
we also have
because
all the asbestos, so.
correct, and that's why it's mostly Nashua, because Nashua is one of the areas that made it, and we have a lot of these disposal sites within Nashua. So we know that it is something that is dealt with here on a regular basis. So we do have that area of the landfill. There's a special fee that they have to pay at the landfill for weight, and it has to be wrapped and bagged in a certain fashion. So those lists are there, and we do frequently show people where those lists are.
Is there like a more condensed guide to, so you're a new landlord, here's what you could do, or here's things you might want to do, like a top 10 things to get checked out, just if you're worried? I mean, if somebody's been managing a building for years, they may not need to go over the whole asbestos abatement part, but
That's an excellent question.
yeah.
Unfortunately, no. As far as I know, there's no guidance document that I've seen at the state level or even the local level here. Some of the things they have to, when you buy a certain property, if asbestos is present and it is known, you have to disclose that to the buyer. Again, if it's known, and that's the caveat. Sometimes people will say, "I didn't know it was there," so that is a problem. So yeah, so there's a lot that's out there that a lot of property owners may not know exactly what they're getting into. And that's an excellent point. That is there this guidance document that would be a great thing to have, but we don't have one as far as I know.
And
Does-
disclosure also has to be made with lead in homes as well.
Correct.
Well, I was actually going to ask that. What things does a landlord have to disclose to a tenant when they're getting ready to occupy?
Lead is one for sure.
I would defer to legal counsel for that question. I'm not entirely sure of everything.
Maybe for a future meeting, or Attorney Bolton?
I'm not aware of any such requirements, but I can check.
Okay, it'd just be good to know. So does the committee have questions as well?
I will say that a landlord is prohibited from renting a unit with lead paint to a family with children. But as far as any general disclosure laws of lead or anything else, I'm unaware.
So we had considerable discussion, sorry, Alderman Jettie, I just saw your hand go up, I think. We had discussion in our previous meeting regarding bed bugs, and so it's my understanding that it can be reported to the Public Health Department, but it really needs to be reported to the state for action to be taken?
No, so the state's not going to essentially do anything with it. It's a local problem. The way that the bedbug law was made in the state, it was a state level action to deal with a problem that's getting worse. Bed bugs it's an issue that is getting worse. It's gotten worse every year for many years. In the last 10 years, really, we've seen rates that have really soared, and every year we're seeing more and more cases. So I believe the intention of the bedbug law was to expedite a process that used to take a little bit of time. So although pests in general are covered under the housing law, RSA 48A, and I believe it is also covered in our local housing code, sometimes the length of the response could take a amount of time in which the bed bugs could, become a larger problem, as if we were to get treatment done sooner. So I believe that the intent of the bedbug law, when we go down to circuit court, is that happens at a faster rate. And if I'm wrong, someone can correct me on that. So I think that does help speed up the process. There is a bedbug action board, the New Hampshire Bedbug Action Board. I do sit on that board. We do meet once every other month. We talk about the issues that are happening within the state, because it's an issue that's happening everywhere. We are looking at what other states are doing to really handle what this current problem is. And that ranges from the proper use of pesticides to, really what the appropriate actions can be versus the certain types of treatments which are out there, whether it's the heat treatment or chemical treatment. And we are looking to review that bedbug law to see what are those gaps. This law was fairly new. How is it working? We're looking to review how that process is actually going, and what we can do to possibly strengthen that. So that's currently what we're working on at the overall kind of state level through that action board.
Are there integrated standards for how to treat? Like you need to use a licensed?
So our state is not as strong as what other states do in terms of a pesticide applicator. The way that the bed bug law is written is that a landlord could essentially self-treat. There's no specific standard of treatment that says has to be done. The law also states that there just has to be a reduction in the number of the bed bugs. It doesn't state that they have to be fully gone, and the reason being is that it's a near impossible task to fully eradicate every bug. So you cannot use that as a standard because there's been a lot of studies that are out there that's saying that it could take an average of 8 to 9 treatments before a bed bug problem in a unit that has had known problems is really fully treated versus units that were looked at didn't have bed bugs, but then a few months later they did, and then they did treatment in those units. The average was 2 to 3 treatments. So it's all about how long the infestation has been going on, what the tenants have been doing to kind of mitigate whatever factors that could be leading to it, what the treatment of the property owner is, what the other housing units around it are. So there's a lot of variables in it, which make treatment and the law very difficult, and how to approach it in a fair and equal manner. And that's what we're kind of currently looking at.
Alderman Jettie, do you have a question?
So does your, you mentioned that you inspect restaurants 2 to 4 times a year.
Yes.
But as far as housing is concerned, that's complaint-based, you don't?
Correct, yeah. I don't know exactly how many housing units we have within Nashua, but I would assume it's well within the thousands or tens of thousands, maybe. And to think that we have 3 field staff that do about 2,000 inspections a year in our restaurants on top of pools, septic. And to think if we tried to schedule something with housing units to do that would be more challenging because you actually would have to schedule that. You can't just show up to a housing unit and just walk in. Where a restaurant, by right, we can do that. We don't want to let them know that we're coming because we don't want to give them the chance to kind of fix everything that they're doing wrong. So we can just kind of show up there and do as many as we can in a day. Housing is a little bit different. You need to either, set up a scheduled time with the landlord or with the tenant. We just can't show up and walk in. So it becomes a challenge. And how do we identify where these places are? How do we keep tabs on it? And having that code office, there's 3 of those guys there, and they do a lot of complaints on a very regular basis. And so that, just like in terms of their housing, as we do with housing in terms of public health, it is sadly a solely complaint-driven area.
What about hotels?
Those are not licensed, so they do not hold a license. There's nothing on the state side of things, statewide, that requires hotels or the motels to have a health license. So although we do license like pools and restaurants, there's no specific health license for those areas. There are a couple towns that have chosen to license them through their health office so they can at least get in there on a fairly regular basis, maybe once a year, just to see what issues are going on there. We do get calls about bed bugs in a hotel room. So we do usually how we handle that, because that falls outside the general realm of a housing code because it's not housing, is we will call up the hotel management. We'll kind of ask them what their bed bug action plan is. How do they normally handle it? What do they do when folks say that they have bed bugs in their room? We ask them, how do they treat? Do they contract a pest management company? How often do they check their own rooms? So we do work with them, although we don't have any jurisdiction there. We have built up the relationship with most of them, so we can call them, we can talk with them, and they work with us to fix the issue, because they clearly don't want their business to go under because of problems that clearly are bad for everybody. So they want to make sure that people that are staying there are safe, because it really brings them in money, right? And makes them look good, makes them clean, which is what they want to be. So they usually do a very good job working with us. There are some exceptions to that, as always, but most of the time they're very good when we call them to do that proper action.
So there isn't really if for motels or hotels particularly, there isn't really anything the city can do in terms of enforcement. Like, we can monitor the pool, we can go to the restaurant, but the actual rooms, there's nothing.
That is my understanding, yes.
With regards to landlords, do you regularly inspect the denser population building sites on a complaint basis? Because my understanding of what you're saying is you don't schedule them, but if somebody complains, you would go investigate then?
Correct. So if the tenant allows us in, we can go. So if, which is generally where the calls come from. Occasionally, we will get a call from a landlord saying that their tenant is not doing the proper prep work for treatment. So they're looking for some guidance on how to handle that. But primarily what we do is the actual tenant will call saying that they have an issue. Because of the bedbug law, we will not go out to inspect for bedbugs. Because really the bedbug law takes it out of any action that we possibly could have done out of our hands. There's really nothing that public health can do. The code office used to do it under the housing code, but again, I think that the bedbug law makes it faster for them to fill out the 540-A form, bring it down to the circuit court, go in front of the judge. Judge usually will say, yep, you got to do treatment if the landlord hasn't been doing it, anything for it, to make sure that the law is being followed, and that usually happens. What the problem is that there are a lot of myths about bedbugs. People think that it's a filth pest. It is not. Anybody can get bedbugs. The problem with cluttered places or places with a lot of items is simply gives bedbugs more places to hide, making treatments harder. So a lot of these places that we'll go into, there's a lot of clutter. And they have a problem with trying to comply with the prep orders from the pest management company to adequately arrange the unit so a proper treatment can happen. Regardless, if it's not prepped, usually the treatment is ordered to get done, so they'll still treat, but they may need more treatments later because they're not effectively treating everything because of how much items are actually present for the bed bugs to hide in. So there are a lot of variables, a lot of factors that tie into the complaint driven. So when we get phone calls, we'll try to guide people on how to best prep their unit or what they can do to try to ease that process for them.
I guess I'm confused because I thought earlier you said that it was almost impossible to eradicate all the bugs. How is there the conclusion that more things in the room are the problem? Is it possible the treatment is just inadequate, or because
Again, it's not that it's the problem. It makes the problem more difficult to treat.
track? Okay.
Right, which is where it comes from because they have more places to hide. And if you're in a multi-unit building, unfortunately, what we would typically say is you want to do the heat treatment because it's the better treatment. It kills eggs, it kills nymphs, it kills the full-grown bed bugs, where a chemical treatment doesn't kill the eggs. So that's why generally you have to treat 2 to 3 weeks later. But in a multi-unit building, which most of our housing is now, is that when you do that heat treatment in that unit, the bed bugs have enough time before that heat gets up to about 120 Fahrenheit to go through the walls or the outlets to get into other units. So all you end up doing is sometimes spreading that problem throughout the whole housing unit. And then you end up seeing people that treat one end of this multi-unit housing. The bed bugs are gone from the right end building, and then they poke up on that left side. And then you treat the left side and you chase them back to the right side. So you have property managers that are chasing this problem back and forth, whether they're doing chemical treatment or heat treatment, because homes are built where walls are fairly open, so bugs travel. That's a problem with having a lot of dense housing or a lot of these high rises where most of these issues are, because it just takes one person to get them. And if they let it go for a few months, because again, time is on your side when you deal with these bed bugs. It takes a lot of time for them to get to a critical mass point. And if you don't deal with them until they're at that critical mass point, it becomes a reactive problem, which you cannot effectively treat. And then all you do is you spread it around. And that creates other problems. And so it does become incredibly difficult. And if you have more items, more stuff for them to hide in, again, you need more and more treatments to do what we would call a effective treatment.
I mean, I guess I'm just confused because I thought earlier when I had said that to report the bed bug issues, you shouldn't go to the city, you should really go to the state and then you coordinate. Can you just go over the process of, if I'm a tenant and I have bed bugs, what am I supposed to do to take action?
So ideally what you would do with the bed bug law is you would notify your landlord. that you think you have bed bugs. The landlord, within a certain amount of time per that bed bug law, they have to go in and respond to your issue. They will verify whether or not that they believe the actual problem is present. And if it is, then they have to do treatment. That's the new process. Clearly, if the landlord is refusing to investigate the issue or treat the issue, that's when they would go fill out that 540-A form, bring it down to the circuit courthouse, and the judge usually orders treatment. That's what usually happens.
So you have to fill out a 540-A form and bring it to the
If
Judge.
the landlord is not doing what he should be doing or she should be doing per the bed bug law. Now, code enforcement, I believe, still will write down and track any complaints that come in through their office, through their CityView software. Unfortunately, we do not have a software system, so there's no effective complaint tracking through the health office currently. We just try to jot down on
Could you
our
tell the
re-
code
on our
enforcement office
report
so
forms.
they can put it on theirs?
So lots of times we will refer people to either call code or to fill out that 540A form if the landlord is not doing that treatment. And then if they have any further questions of a legal manner, we will usually ask, say that they could call legal aid if they have any of those questions.
In the 540A, if it's the one I remember right, it says that if the person who's reporting it is found to be liable or the tenant is found to be liable, like the cause, then they're liable for the cost of treatment?
There is that provision, as far as I know, built in, is that if they can prove that the origination of the bed bugs was in a particular unit, and I believe that if no other infestations or reports were in, I believe, that housing unit within a period of time, I believe it's 6 months, I would have to check on that. Then if they can prove essentially that that's where the bed bugs came from, was that certain unit, then yes, the landlord could recoup costs.
Is the landlord required to tell a tenant complaining about bed bugs whether that unit has been recently treated or whatever, particularly if they're a new tenant?
I am not sure. I do not have that answer.
Because I'm kind of imagining a scenario where somebody tells their landlord that there's bed bugs. Their landlord tells them, oh, well, according to this statute here, if we treat it, it's all going to be on you because you're the one who brought it in. And there might have been someone there 3 months ago maybe who had it, and they don't actually have to tell them that.
And if there was a complaint on file through either the courts or the code office, they could certainly give them a call because those files are present. They do keep those. So that's always a way that if someone's looking to move into a particular unit, they do always have that option to call up and ask if there's been any issues in that unit prior to them renting it. That is something that I think people can do.
If multiple tenants, because we were talking about heat treatment maybe driving them back and forth or whatever, if multiple tenants fill out a 540A or complain to their landlord, who's identified as liable for treatment?
I'm not entirely sure. All I know is that the landlord, usually by the law, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they pay all the upfront costs for that bed bug law. If, again, they can prove that it originated from a single unit and there's been no other issues in that area, they could recoup the cost. So I would assume if there's multiple people saying that they all have bed bugs, there's no way to prove where the origination came from, that the landlord usually eats that cost. And that's what happens lots of times is the landlords just end up paying for everything, and costs have risen to people spending tens of thousands of dollars every year in our multi-unit housing areas on bedbug treatment, and that probably has a effect on rents.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember a case a couple of years ago of a landlord with multiple units in their building. A mattress was removed from a unit that was infested with bed bugs and left in a hallway for several months, which obviously infected multiple units at once. So obviously the best practice for the landlord would be to treat immediately if there's concern and not allow multiple tenants to have simultaneous concerns.
Yeah, and we try to educate folks that do call and do have those like questions on what the proper action is. So there have been landlords that have called because they're curious. Okay, what's the best way to handle this? So we'll kind of walk them through it. We'll kind of help them. We'll kind of educate them as well as their like actual tenants. A lot of the housing folks in the city have called us and asked how do we best handle this, and all the units that they serve, a lot of property management companies. So we have given a lot of guidance to try to help them and how to deal with those issues, how to deal with those like bureaus or those like mattresses to have them, not to leave them in hallways, to, throw them out and either mark them, with a red pen or even write bed bugs on them or scratch them up so people don't take them and then bring it to their homes, which is an issue. And then every resident too does have the right, I believe, for 5 oversized pickups through solid waste, that if there's anything that goes to the curbside, every resident does have that pickup. They can call and request that these items be picked up. So that is something that solid waste does.
Are there any recommendations you have for us as a committee or areas that you think we can improve on as a city and how we address these situations? You kind of described it as a rising trend in environmental issues, and I know that at the state level they're adapting their approaches, as you said, revisiting that RSA.
Yeah, so we're looking at the current bed bug law. We're looking at what could be done to possibly strengthen that. In the future, I also sit on the board for the New Hampshire Health Officers at the state level, and we're currently in the middle of revising our bed bug documentation because the other health officers in the state who don't maybe have as much knowledge in this area, that's one of their biggest questions that we always get. So we always guide them and help those other health officers as well. So we're currently in the midst of revising that for them. We give a lot of training throughout there. So, one of the biggest things that's always crucial is education. I mean, ideally, it would be great if we could, get out as much info as we could to tenants, to landlords, to educate them that this is not something to think that, I don't want to tell someone that I have bed bugs because it reflects poor hygiene, because that's not true. It does not. Like I said, it's not a filth pest. So I think the best thing that we can do, at least in terms of health, is to get out as much education as we can to tell people that this is not something to feel that it's a stigma, because it isn't. Everybody deals with them. Bed bugs have always been an issue. There was a little lapse of time from the 1950s to the 1990s where we didn't see them because of like DDT, but once that was gone, we learned how bad that was. Bed bugs started coming back. So this is an issue we've always dealt with for all of mankind, other than a few short years. So we need to get back to that mindset that these are just pests. And if we understand how to look for them, how to watch for them, how to act on it, be proactive instead of reactive, that's where we got to step in. That's what we got to do, I think, as a city or as like public health, is to get people in that proactive mindset that if they think that they have an issue, to act on it as soon as they possibly can and not let it wait. Because waiting, usually it takes 3 to 4 months before a bad bed bug problem becomes a problem, because it takes all that time for them to breed and to have eggs and to get to that critical mass stage. So if you know what to recognize in those first couple weeks when you see a couple bugs, that problem's gone because you can stop it. So that's what we have to do, is really get out as much education as we possibly can and to teach people that these are just bugs. It's okay to really talk about it. So in my opinion, that's what kind of we can do.
And in terms of legislation, resources, and investigation, we put the same emphasis on bed bugs that we would any other public health issue or, code enforcement issue or safety issue or whatever?
Yeah, because bed bugs do not transmit any illness, they're not seen as a public health threat, which is why they're also difficult to deal with. But yeah, I would say we'd put the same stressor on it that we would for any other code issue, right? Clearly, it's something that is not good for the person. It's not good for the landlord either. It's not good for them to have bugs in their house. It's not good for the tenant, because if they're dealing with a chronic problem, they could have other health problems like mental health or allergies. If they're scratching a lot, they get problems with their skin. So these are issues that do have to be dealt with, and I do think that we do got to put some sort of like emphasis on it, but we got to make sure we put the right kind on it. We don't want to overkill it. We want to educate and treat them as they are, and that's simply bugs. And if we know how to treat them, if we understand how they operate, then really they're nothing to be scared of. But it's getting people to that mindset.
It seems like from a landlord's perspective, it's probably more of a logistics issue. If it's expensive to treat them, it's difficult to know what will be effective.
Right.
Making sure that early action and regular inspection is obviously recommended, but then not necessarily penalizing people who are reporting it, because, as a landlord, they're doing you a favor in helping prevent a building-wide, infestation.
Right. It's building that trust between the actual tenants, between the landlords, between the people that are doing the actual pest management treatment. If you can get all of them to work and get on the same page, then really those models have been shown to reduce the bedbug problems in those multi-unit housings. When you get everybody working, talking, and being on the same page, those bedbug rates in certain studies have dropped by as much as like 30%. So it does have a huge role if all those parties are actually talking and they're talking about it and they're treating it as a whole. So it's trying, once again, to get all those people in that same room, them talking about it and not having that danger or that fear that they may get kicked out because of something that's really not truly their fault. So that's where we're currently at.
Is there any statistics or reports online, maybe on the website, that can say how prolific this issue really is in Nashua, or?
Specifically in Nashua, no. I did bring my bedbug Bible with me, and I joke, but it's this giant book is all about bedbugs.
As long as you don't bring the farm.
It was just published this past year, and it does talk about rates. The rates have gone up. The most current data is 2016 around the U.S. For pest management. So these are only the cases that have been known about, and cases where a pest management pro has come in to actually treat. From 2015, let's say, to 2016, some of the two worst years, there were about 815,000 cases in 2015 to about 930,000 cases in 2016. So we're jumping up in leaps and bounds of 100,000 plus cases every year, and that's been a pretty steady rise. So it is a problem. It's a problem everywhere, not just in the U.S., but around the whole world. Maybe just a different species. There's a few different kinds of them, but it is a rising problem, and there's a whole bunch of folks talking about how do we really effectively deal with this, because we know that it is that actual problem. So there is a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of talk on how do we deal with this. It's just trying to get to that right stage about what is the best way to actually do that.
Well, what's the status of your complaint software? Because, I mean, that's come up at a couple of different budget.
Yes,
Meetings.
our licensing and permitting software for environmental health is, we're currently, I'm not sure how far away from it. I believe they're done for the most part with building, and I think they're moving on to code enforcement and maybe planning, and then environmental is a little bit down the way, so I would
These
hope
other
within the next
departments
year.
have software already?
So most other places do use City View. We do not have that.
That might be something to talk to the mayor and say, like, can we get higher up on the list because we have nothing? Especially if this is a rising trend regionally and nationally, it would be pretty good to know where we are in comparison to other communities. And if we're not even able to track complaints,
It's coming time. The IT's
I
got a
want
whole
it now.
It
program
is,
that
yeah,
they're
it
working
is
department
busy.
by
It's,
department on.
It's a very hefty software. I know there's a lot of aspects to it, and I know we are on that list, and I know we are coming. I just don't know how
right, I was just
quickly
saying,
that
maybe
will
we could
be.
put you further up on the list since you have nothing. I don't have any other questions. If anyone else have any comments or?
I do.
Yes.
Thank you. I think the idea that Alderman Lopez gave about landlord's guide, I think that would be a wonderful thing to create. Specifically to say that the first time you get any notice that there are bed bugs, that you need to report it, and it should go to code so that they can keep track of it. I think there's a lot of things that you could help, because most landlords are really not interested in seeing bed bugs infest their buildings. I think when you get notifications when there are a lot of places in one building that report this, that there should be some process that the landlord needs to go through to make sure that it is done, the whole building. I'm not sure what we could do about that, but I think it's pretty clear that there are some buildings in the city that fall into that category. We've had some people tell us anecdotally about problems that they've just moved in and had everything that they've got infested with bed bugs. And perhaps before somebody moves into an apartment like that, there should be some sort of test that if it had bed bugs in the past, that they are gone. I know it's really hard, especially but if it's heat treated, would it be more likely totally eradicated?
It would if it was a single-family house, because then you're heat treating everything, and therefore they're gone. Again, the problem is multi-family units, where you have multiple units in one building. There could be no one living in there, so bed bugs are attracted to our body heat, to our CO2 as we're breathing. So even if no one's living there, the unit's vacant, someone could go in, and during that visit, they're not gonna see a single bed bug because they're not in that room, because there's nothing there to actually feed on. So they're in other units. But if someone, as soon as someone moves back in, bed bugs forage, and they can travel a pretty long ways in a fairly short time at night while they're searching. And then that's when they can get back in that unit, and now all of a sudden, the unit where there was nothing to eat now has food in it. So now they'll just kind of settle in and start to live there. So that's it's a great thought. Unfortunately, to go into a vacant unit and verify that bed bugs are gone doesn't mean that they're gone from that building. And they hide very well, and you have to really know to look behind, like in walls and behind the outlet covers. You got to take them off and really look for ones that are really hiding. So they're very good at squeezing into any crack and any crevice. Excellent hiders. So it's really a daunting task to go in and say, yep, that there's nothing here, because there could be one or two hiding.
Do you think it's possible that we could ask the state to help us with this?
There is no funding that's available for bed bugs. There's nothing on a government level. The other problem is that a building could be perfectly free, and all it takes is one person to come in, and they either bring them on themselves or they bring them on an item. And again, not many people know what they're looking for. And then a few months later, you start seeing lots and lots of bugs. You're not sure what they are, because that is the primary vehicle of how bed bugs get into buildings, is either on someone or on an item. And so when you have a lot of people living in the same building and you get a lot of visitors and a lot of items, you increase your risk hundreds of times, because you have all that extra traffic than you would in a single family unit or 2 units. And that's why we're seeing more and more issues in multifamily units than we are in single families.
It's a pyramid. It just
Exactly, correct.
inverted, gets worse. Just one more question. Can we require that landlords report?
Like to the city offices if they have it? I'm not sure if we could do that. That's not a question that I could answer.
Might be one for Attorney Bolton.
I don't see any reason why we couldn't put that in our housing standards. It creates a burden on the code enforcement office. The more time they spend cataloging complaints, the less time they're out doing inspections. So I think you have to weigh the utility of doing it versus getting more inspections done, whether by the existing complement of inspectors, or if you were to want to spend more resources, more money, do you accomplish more by hiring more inspectors to do inspections, or more clerks to catalog sort of passive reports of landlords who had a reported bed bug problem, they remediated it, and the problem's been eradicated, at least for the time being. So that obviously is a value question for all of you.
And the thing with reporting, even with the state, with some communicable diseases, once there's a report, then there's usually some action that's necessary to be taken afterwards. And so we would have to look at the capacity of the city, whether it's environmental health or code enforcement, to be able to keep up with that. So sure, we would get the documentation of it, but if I'm a resident and I report, I'm going to be expecting something to be done about, there's some follow-up behind my report, and we don't have the capacity to do that. So I
the
think
capacity
the
might be
big
a
piece
bigger
around the
issue.
education, is so important, because they do travel. Bed bugs can go into hiding and not feed for months. And then, as Ren said, once there's a living, breathing body there, then they come out to where they can feed. So knowing, being able to identify, and then having some response as quickly as possible from, the landlords, or even if folks can separate, things out and not put mattresses on the side of the street or other furnitures that people can then pick up and then take to their apartments unknowingly, are things and ways that we can kind of cut back on some of that.
To Alderman Schmidt's point, though, landlords don't have to be the only ones to report. We don't license motels or hotels, which is where people most likely would be going to if they had a sudden eviction or coming from. So it may be, given that the health department is complaint-driven and doesn't have scheduled inspections of this type of situation, it might be good to create a process for clusters where it's likely to happen repeated times and then pass it on to multiple places, rather than creating a blanket rule where everybody and anybody is impacted. It's definitely something to consider, though. I think it would have to be tied with a way to actually meet the demand that might get created. But if what I'm hearing is the fear is that it might create too much demand, then that means we have a problem, and we shouldn't just ignore it.
Right.
Any other thoughts? All right, well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate all the work you do, especially given what we've heard tonight.
Thank you.
And our next agenda item is going to be tenant rights and responsibilities with a presentation by New Hampshire Legal Assistance. So if you guys would like to come up, grab a seat.
Good evening. My name is Candace E. Capio Gebhardt, and I'm a paralegal at New Hampshire Legal Assistance. New Hampshire Legal Assistance, as I'm sure most of you know, is a legal aid office. We provide free, no-cost legal assistance to income-qualified people throughout New Hampshire. I think we're the best law firm in the whole state. In only civil legal matters, so we don't do anything criminal. And we deal with basic needs like housing, benefits. We have a youth law project, a family law project, but I'm here today to talk about our housing project and how people access our services. Our budget was cut some time ago. We had a Nashua office, which we had to close. And now the portal to get to NHLA is through our sister organization, which is the Legal Advice and Referral Center, or LARC. And people who are 60 years and under go to LARC through their website, which is nhlegalaid.org, or by calling them. And they complete an application for assistance. In the case of bed bugs, they just call in and say, you know, I have bed bugs and my landlord doesn't do anything. LARC sorts through these applications for assistance and prioritizes them based on what we see are priorities. So our first priority is to keep people housed and stop evictions. And so at the first instance, if someone is coming in and saying, I have a landlord and he or she is not responding, we ask them to get specific about what that response is or has been. And we ask them to self-advocate a little bit before we get involved, simply because we don't have enough staff to deal with every application that comes through the door. So the first defense is to write the landlord or text him and say, I have bed bugs. And then the law says that that landlord must respond by coming and inspecting and figuring out what to do within 7 days. And that's a very important first step. At that point, if the landlord doesn't respond, we suggest that the tenant do proper rent withholding, and there is a process for doing that, and we tell them how to do that. And if the landlord, and usually that gets a landlord's attention. You don't pay your rent for a specific reason. We ask them to set the rent aside and keep it. And as soon as the landlord does do some kind of remediation or extermination, we tell them that they should pay the rent. If the landlord still doesn't respond, we suggest that they call code enforcement, have an inspection done. If code enforcement is busy or can't get there immediately, then we do tell them to go to court and file what's called a 540A petition, and to tell the judge, write out on this petition, which doesn't cost any money, and the clerk will give them a form, to tell the judge in as few words as possible, when the bed bugs were noticed, when the landlord was contacted, that there was no response, if there was a demand letter or a rent withholding requested, to attach that to the 548 petition. And then they will get an order that directs the landlord to remediate within a specific period of time. At that point, if the landlord does not do that, NHLA will come in and take the case for direct representation. And that means going to a further hearing so the judge can decide what the landlord did or did not do. The gentleman from the health department talked about the presumption of who is it that is presumed responsible, and the RSA speaks to that, and we're talking about RSA 540 capital letter A:3, and in subset or sections 4 and 5. And what the law says is a tenant is deemed or presumed to be responsible if the unit has been bed bug free for 6 months, and if there are no other reports in adjacent units, upstairs, downstairs, left and right. If that is the case, and a certified pest control company determines that the source was that unit, that the tenant somehow brought them in, then they are presumed to be responsible. Yes, the landlord has to pay the upfront cost, but then the tenant is responsible for reimbursing the landlord through a reasonable repayment agreement based on the tenant's income. So if you've got a tenant, on SSI at $750 a month, and their rent is $600 a month, and a heat treatment costs on average of $1,400, the landlord can't say, I demand that you pay this and pay this now, or within 3 months or 6 months. They have to have a negotiating session about what is reasonable, and both sides have to be reasonable. We have a lot of brochures. We and LARC offer templates for demand letters, for rent withholding. Everything from, plain, do you need legal help, to tenants' rights and responsibilities. We give presentations anywhere, anytime someone wants us. We meet with tenants. My colleague Elliot Berry does presentations with private attorneys to talk about landlord and tenant responsibilities, because it's not a one-way street. And there are great landlords, and then there are landlords who are perhaps less than deluxe. But, through this law and through the tools that we have, we hope to set some good examples, and so they should know a landlord who is not as speedy on the remediation will know that there are consequences.
So I just wanted to move back to a point you'd made earlier in terms of paying the rent. It is not a good idea for a tenant to just withhold rent without documenting why or how or what's going on with that.
They can't do that. Cannot. That is, we always say proper rent withholding, and that doesn't mean calling your landlord or sending him or her a text in 140 characters or less that says no rent, right? bed bugs.
I think it sounds like you're citing a specific case.
You'd be surprised what I see.
Mhm.
I mean, first of all, to do proper rent withholding, your rent can't be late. Your rent must be current and up to date. So we always tell people to pay their rent, to send a demand letter. If they've already texted or called the landlord and he or she is being unresponsive, then we suggest rent withholding by sending a letter that says, dear Mr. Landlord, we talked on, May 25th, and today's June 5th, and you still haven't responded about my bed bugs. I've paid the rent, and I'm putting you on notice that if you do not do something in 14 days by June 19th, I'm going to withhold my July rent. And then we give the advice that the tenant should go get a money order for that rent, not keep it in their bank account, hold it aside, because ultimately they're going to have to pay the rent when the landlord steps up to the plate.
Right, so even if the landlord does the repairs after a rent withhold, it isn't like, well, I don't know you for the month of April because you hadn't
Exactly.
fixed that yet. They're
Or I
still gonna
had
have
to
to
go
pay their
stay
rent.
in a motel, you owe me my motel. I took my motel out of my rent money. You have to pay that. You have to make up that difference. That's not the way the law works.
Well, I think it's important to note that too, because for a landlord who's not anticipating a sudden cleaning or treatment expense, the last thing they need is to have people threatening the income that they are making and, trying to set their own rules. So I think
Absolutely. I
communication
mean,
is key.
we try to tell people the right way to do it, and we tell them if they're doing it wrong, and to start all over again. And people don't want to hear that, but that's the law, that's the framework we have to work within.
The language that you described, I had read it earlier, or I had read it after our last meeting as well, and it did seem to imply at the beginning that the onus was on the tenant as the likely cause, just through the way that the language was prioritized. So it says presumed unless, and then there are those conditions.
Right.
But that
But-
is still
but-
something that can be pretty intimidating to a tenant.
Yes, it can. Yes, it can.
If multiple units are complaining simultaneously, it's less certain who the
I
culprit
am
is.
not
or
a bed bug expert.
ologist.
We have had big buildings where there are multiple complaints, but through inspections, a pest control company has been able to narrow it down where the source of that, and I'm thinking about a building in Portsmouth, and they were able to tell the property manager what they believe to be the source of that infestation. So, I mean, they're getting better and better, and I don't know how they do it. That's not my job.
It does seem like it might be good to consider at the state level, including that requirement for how the treatment is happening and making sure that the party is qualified to do it, though. I mean, we heard that pretty consistently, that bed bugs are incredibly hard to treat, they're incredibly complicated, so not even requiring a license or anything, it seems like it's just not really.
We always
Prepping
tell
for
people
success.
to contract with a certified pest control company that has a certificate in bed bug remediation. There's something called bed bug boot camp that these people go to, and they learn about not only best practices, but what kind of treatment to use in different housing situations. I mean, there's chemical treatment, there's heat treatment, there's diatomaceous earth that I mean, there are many, many different things. And tenants can help themselves. I'm always amazed that tenants don't ask, have there been bed bugs in this unit?
Do they have to answer?
Well, if they don't answer, I think that's a problem. I mean, everybody wants to be aware of what's going on. They don't have any duty currently to tell you if there have been bed bugs, but you can ask.
Well, and given the stigma, and we did kind of discuss burden a little bit on landlords, it might not necessarily be the fairest thing to do to require somebody who treated for bed bugs to tell every tenant that, because with the stigma, a lot of people might not necessarily want that unit. So either they have to undercharge it in order to get it occupied, or
They don't have to,
whatever.
I'm not suggesting that a tenant, a landlord has a duty um, to offer the information, but if a prospective tenant asks, I think a landlord needs to
Should
be honest.
yeah. And there is that. And then there is also the possible role of the city of at least having the information available if there is further action taken. Because if it's not actually being documented anywhere and the landlord's taking care of it privately, you would have to actively figure out how that is happening in order to prove that you weren't the one who brought your bed bugs in. And that, I don't know how a tenant would
You
even
know,
do that.
you would be surprised. By the time people get to us, they tell most of the time they tell the truth. And in extreme cases of infestation, clutter is usually a problem. And sometimes people just say, I went to that secondhand store and I bought some clothes, and then I got bed bugs. Or I bought that, cushy reclining chair. I didn't have them before, but I kind of noticed them after that. I mean, sometimes, and then they're afraid to report it because they're afraid they're going to get evicted. And we're trying to get the word out that that's not how you get evicted. You need to report, and hopefully the landlord will react appropriately.
How does Nashua do compared to other cities in New Hampshire?
I don't know. We're not keeping statistics.
I was wondering I was hoping you did. Do you feel like you answer a lot of calls in Nashua versus other places, or if it doesn't make an impression, I guess that's a good thing.
It was worse a few years ago. It was worse to us from the number of cases that we see 3 or 4 years ago. Right now, it seems like we have more cases coming from in and around the greater Manchester area. But that's totally anecdotal, not based on science.
No, it's just a sense. What other types of situations do you typically encounter between landlords and tenants?
Non-payment of rent. Hoarding is becoming more and more of an issue.
What are I assume tenants have obligation to make sure that exits or windows are cleared, that kind of stuff?
The access and egress, yes, absolutely. And that's more so in properties that are subsidized with HUD money. And they go through then an annual inspection to make sure that those pathways are clear.
Are there obligations on behalf of the landlord for how much has to be left before they're not, I mean, if someone leaves all their stuff in an apartment for eviction, what does the landlord do? Do they have to get rid of it right away? Do they have to store it for them?
The law changed, I don't know, a year or so, 2 years ago? I don't remember.
More like 5, I think.
It used to be that landlord, once the writ of possession issued and the tenants were gone, a landlord had to keep the personal property safe for 28 days, which, put landlords, that was another burden. That's a whole nother month. Now the statute is 7 days. So once the tenants leave and the writ of possession has been served, landlord has 7 days to keep everything safe. The landlord also has to be available to the tenant to make an appointment so the tenant can get their things out. The landlord shouldn't be ignoring the telephone calls or the text messages, regardless of how mad they might be. And you can also always call the police department for standby assistance.
Does anyone else have any questions? Alderman Jetty?
I have a question about New Hampshire Legal Assistance's ability to properly service the Nashua area and the residents of Nashua who need your services.
It's a bummer. It's hard, but it's hard for us, to go wherever we don't have an office. It's especially hard because, our office here was really a walk-in law office, and people could walk in and fill out an application right there on the spot. About 50% of the time, somebody was there to talk to them, a staff paralegal or attorney. We had 2 attorneys, we had 3 paralegals. We had a full-time receptionist who spoke English and Spanish. It's awful not being able to have an office here. We just don't have the funds. We try to partner with other nonprofits, and they are generous enough to allow us to use a conference room to meet with clients, so we don't have to meet at the Dunkin' Donuts or McDonald's. It's fairly private. We do the best we can. We, Elliott Berry covers this part of the southern part of the state from Nashua south and over to Portsmouth and Plymouth and Dover. I mean, we are stretched thin, but we try not to let that stop us.
So may I follow up?
Yes.
So under your present constraints, if somebody from Nashua calls, do you have paralegal or somebody who can meet them in Nashua?
Absolutely.
Yeah, could you
at a
tell
mo-
us about that?
At a moment's notice, yeah. The Nashua Soup Kitchen allows us to use their conference room. If someone calls, and the other thing is, we ask them to send us copies of their documents. If they have an eviction notice or a demand for rent, we like to see those before we talk to them, or warning letters from landlords. They can go to the library, they can go to the soup kitchen, they can go to many places and have those documents faxed to us at no cost. And once we get them, we call them and we make an appointment to visit. I mean, we can be here the same day if it's really an emergency, or certainly within 24 hours. And all of our advocates from the Manchester office take cases here in Nashua. We have a paralegal who does Social Security work. She does youth law work, so she's here, often. This is kind of on my way home, the long way around the bend. And I attend community meetings here to talk about and hopefully prevent homelessness through the continuum of care and through the elder wrap. I'm here, on a weekly basis. So I try to tie that in with a client appointment if that's necessary. We are lean, but we are there to keep people housed and to make sure that they have at least a subsistence income to keep them stable.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
If you ever have trouble finding a meeting space, I know the soup kitchen's probably full of backpacks right now, so feel free to reach out. I'm sure I can find somebody who's willing to partner.
It's never been a problem. It has never been a problem. So, I mean, I've met people who are being evicted from Nashua Housing Authority, and they give me a conference room to talk with the tenant. So we make it work.
Mm-hmm.
All nonprofits are dealing with scarce resources and limited budgets and not enough people to help those in need, and it's you just have to be creative. Any other questions?
You ready?
I brought a bunch of brochures, if you want to take them, or shall I just leave them?
Yeah, I think we can. Are they scannable? We could probably attach them to the minutes.
Absolutely, sure. They're also on the website, but absolutely, you can do that.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you very much.
You're welcome, thank you.
I can ask her. All right, so that was our last agenda item. If we have any other issues for discussion by Alderman or general comment? If there's none, then Alderman Laws?
No, I was just gonna say how grateful I am for everyone who spoke tonight. And, it's a lot of information. It's kind of daunting, but it's also hopeful at the same time. I'm glad we have these people working for the city. That's it.
Right, and I think it's important for us as a committee to remember that there's the dual relationship here. There's the relationship of the city on behalf of its tenants, but also on behalf of its landlords. And that effectively, if we're all communicating and making sure that we understand the problem effectively, we're most likely to be able to treat issues that are unusual without interfering with the overall flow of things. Because there are plenty of issues to be concerned with economically, making sure we don't create unfair burdens for landlords. But there's also just the pragmatic, we don't have extra housing stock. We have like 0 vacancy in the city, so we can't afford to take whole units offline because some of them are having a difficult time, and we're treating the entire landlord sector the same. So the purpose of these meetings so far has really just been to understand the issues. We've kind of had some ideas about tweaking legislation, but it's probably a good opportunity to remind everybody that we don't have a larger agenda. We're not trying to shut anybody down or create new codes or anything like that. Is that fair? All right, so if we now can have public comment. Does anybody in the public who would like to comment on anything relevant to substandard living conditions? Just as you approach the mic, make sure you give your name and your address.
Hi, my name is Chanel Holland. I reside at 237 Main Street, and I've been there since June. And from the very first day, it has been bed bugs. I have been back and forth to court maybe a total of 3 times now, and the landlord has refused to treat the apartment. She has threatened us. She has accused us of bringing the bed bugs. She has threatened us with eviction and pretty much has harassed us over and over repeatedly over the matter, and it's unbearable. I have photos of bites that swell up. I've been sent home from work. I don't sleep. And it's just too much. I've never been in a place where somebody would be so cruel and know that you have an infestation of bugs and constantly just disregard it. I have small grandchildren I can't bring to the house. There's bugs that's on my clothes. Every day is a constant nightmare. And I feel like I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place because we have no window of anything to get out. Because she's threatening us to sue us. She has enormous fees that she's just trying to accumulate on. And we've been letting her know from day one. We took photographs, we took pictures, we submitted it to her, and it just seems to be going out in one ear and out the other. And basically, she's just like, when we try to sit down and talk with her, like, listen, just let us out of the lease. Whatever you choose to do with the property, that's fine. We asked her to put our apartment on the list so that people can come and view it. She basically says, no, I'm not doing that. You're gonna stay. And if you leave, I'm gonna sue you for everything that I could get, and I will get it. She has texted our phone all hours of the night when we said we were at work, and she constantly kept doing it. I just went to court with her on the 1st. I went back again on the 8th, and it's just a total nightmare. And I can't take it anymore. I can't live like that. My belongings have been destroyed. My clothes are now in bags, plastic trash bags. It's unbearable. And I've been trying to do every remedy. I spend money constantly trying to treat my own apartment. It's every day, bugs, bugs, bugs. It's like it's not getting any better. The apartment has 8 units, and another person just recently moved out, and now it's 3 actually families left in there, including myself. And I just need someone to help us.
Typically in public comment, it's the public comments, but if the board's okay, I just would like to ask a
Okay.
couple clarifying questions. The steps that we discussed prior throughout this meeting, have you reported and been in contact with the health department and code enforcement?
We went to code enforcement. Code enforcement informed us to go to the courts and file a 540A, and we did that. We continuously done it. I went back into like 3 times, and the first judgment, the judge did order that because she treated it at that time, that it was pretty much, okay, she treated it, that's what she can do.
She met the conditions.
Yes, but she also stated in open court that she was going to continue to do it every month, and it has not been done from the time that we went to court. So it just seems that she treats it for the moment. It's been resolved, and she feels like, okay, I don't have to do anything else. Our rent is current. We don't owe anything, and we just recently gave her our 30 days because I can't take it anymore. We can't take it. It's a very embarrassing thing to go to work in public and have bugs on you.
We appreciate the courage it takes to come forward and speak because, I mean, as much as we want to say it shouldn't be stigmatized, it's not a filth insect and whatever, there's definitely a stigma attached to it. And the conditions you're describing are deeply impactful to your life. You can't bring people into your apartment. You're having economic impacts to it. You're spending money that you don't even have. You don't have choices to move to other places. So we are sympathetic to that. And as we do try to strike the balance between the needs of tenants and the needs for landlords, I think there also is a role for the city to identify situations where not enough is being done or minimum conditions are inadequate to address the situation.
Yes.
Is there any further comment?
Earlier today, I spoke with the mayor, and he contacted me. He asked me to bring any and all documentation of the ongoing case that I have with my landlord, and I did bring that. I just appreciate just being heard.
Well,
And maybe
it's
someone it can
encouraging that the
help.
mayor's taking a direct
Yeah.
hand in this. And, I mean, we are listening. That's what the committee's for.
Yes, I really appreciate it. Because at the end of the day, the whole situation is that someone else doesn't have to go through what we go through. And that's the biggest thing. No one should have to step into an environment and feel like they can't be safe in their own home or feel the way that I feel. So I want it to be known. I want the landlord to be held accountable and not just keep getting away with it.
Thank you for coming forward.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to make public comment?
Can I ask a question?
Sure. You have to state your name and address for the record. The transcriber needs it.
Sure. My name is Christy Basada. I live at 12 Nutmeg Drive in Nashua, and I'm also the housing advocate at the Front Door Agency, and that's at 7 Concord Street in Nashua. It's in that capacity that I'm coming today. Our agency, and actually I, am the administrator for the Housing Security Guarantee Program, which is a security deposit loan program, also the Homeless Housing Access Revolving Loan Fund, another security deposit first month's rent program through the state. Also the ESG grant, which comes from HUD and is the Rapid Rehousing Program, and our housing stability programs for back rent and utility assistance to prevent evictions. So in that role, I see a tremendous amount of movement between properties because I'm dealing with families who are homeless, who are moving between, but maybe low income and need help with security deposits and various things like that. And I can corroborate the difficulty that I hear from clients like Chanel who are struggling with this. A question that I have I guess for you all, and maybe a larger question for the Board of Aldermen, is in a situation, as was just described, if a tenant wishes to leave the apartment for their own safety and well-being, I mean, she's describing loss of income when she's being sent home from work, if I heard her correctly. What kind of redress is available regarding the security deposit, considering that's a program I administer, and can their security deposits be withheld by the landlord if they vacate the property for reasons of their health and unaddressed bedbug issues?
Attorney Bolton, is that something you'd like to comment on?
Yeah.
The law provides that the landlord has to provide a habitable living situation for the tenant. So if it could arise in different situations, right? A tenant could just stop paying the rent. Well, if the tenant just stops paying the rent, you heard a little earlier about there's a proper way to do that and a less than formal, less than proper way to do that. If it's done properly, whatever the issue is, bed bugs or whatever else, when the landlord remediates the problem, then the rent should be paid and you're there. If rent is withheld properly, the landlord doesn't remediate the situation, but tries to evict the tenant, that's a defense to the eviction, that the rent was withheld with proper notice and properly done. If the tenant just wants to up and leave, and it doesn't often happen, but a landlord could theoretically sue the tenant for the balance of the lease term, less any mitigation by substitute tenant and rent recouped in that way. The lack of habitability would be a defense for that tenant who had left in a case like that also. If, regardless of why a tenant has left, whether it's the end of the lease or whether the tenant is asserting a lack of habitability, the landlord has 30 days to return or account for the security deposit. So the landlord sends the proper letter and says that, well, you owe this much rent, and there was this cleaning to be done or this repair to be done. Cleaning is actually not a reason to take it from the security deposit, but broken window, damaged carpet, hole in the wall, all these repairs add up to X dollars. And by the time you add all that up, it's more than the security deposit, so you owe me $200, and please send your check immediately. Landlords will tell you they've not yet gotten the first check in response to a letter such as that. If the tenant, the prior tenant in this case, does not agree with that calculation for any reason, one, the apartment wasn't habitable, so they shouldn't have had to pay rent. Any other rent that was in arrears, they shouldn't owe for because they properly withheld it and no remediation took place. If a tenant brings the landlord to court asserting these reasons for disagreement with the landlord's accounting on the security deposit, the tenant can recover, the prior tenant can recover twice the amount of the security deposit or twice the amount of wrongfully withheld security deposit. So if the security deposit's $1,000 and the court said, well, the landlord had a reason to withhold $100 of it, well, didn't have a reason to withhold the other $9, judgment can be for that prior tenant in the amount of $1,800. And if they've paid a lawyer to deal with this, they can get attorney's fees as well. Commonly, people in this situation can't afford to hire lawyers, so that doesn't come up all that often, but it is in the statute. So, yeah, there are things and remedies that a tenant has. It's a hassle if people don't want to take time off from work, and as I think we've heard, sometimes going to court just once is not sufficient. Sometimes things get continued, or landlords are given time to correct situations, and then there's a review hearing to see what has transpired in the meantime, different situations, can cause frustration with the court system because the judge doesn't go out and inspect daily to see if the judge's order has been complied with. So it's up to the litigant, the tenant in the cases we're talking about, if the landlord is not doing what the judge said to do, it's the tenant that has to go back and file a motion for contempt or bring it to the court's attention, and another hearing gets scheduled. So that may mean 2 trips to court, one to file the motion and another one to attend the hearing whenever it's scheduled. So it is for some people, a frustrating experience.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any further public comment? All right, seeing none, we will move to remarks by members of the board, starting with.
I just have a question on what you just said. I wish Kansas hadn't taken off. Does NHLA represent tenants in situations like that? Do we know?
In eviction cases, they certainly do. I think they probably put somewhat less a priority on getting security deposits returned. Now, with the front door agencies programs, they might have a lawyer that's willing to help them out, or they may develop their own expertise in these cases, and the court would probably listen to them if they were assisting a tenant. And in some cases, it would be in that agency's best interest to have the security deposit returned, because that becomes part of their revolving fund to help other people. So,
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I think we've had a lot of information. We're gonna have to kind of digest it a little bit. So we had talked about having New Hampshire legal assistance material added to the minutes. I just also wanted to note that we also received an email from Stacy Lawton that was addressed to the board. It was forwarded by the aldermanic assistant, but I don't think it made it to the minutes or to the agenda. So I will ask to have that attached to the minutes following the meeting, just so that is on the record, because they had asked for it to be put that way. All right, if there's no further business, then I will take a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Yep. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so we are adjourned at 8:32. Thanks for coming.